I don't know if all of you know who Howard Zinn actually was. He was a historian. He had a PhD in history from Columbia University. He was born in 1922 and he died in 2010. And just recently on August 24th, there was the 100th year anniversary celebration of his birthday. And I attended that online, and I learned that his books just keep on selling. When I wrote this book, and I think they did a great job with the cover, don't you think so? The red actual image of him, red for more than one reason, as we'll find out if you don't know. When I wrote that, it came out in 2019, I estimated that his book had sold A People's History of the United States, which came out in 1980 originally. It's been through numerous editions, many, many printings. In 2019, I had estimated that it had sold 3 million copies. Already that was phenomenal for a book of its type. A couple of weeks ago, that there are now 4 million copies that have been sold. People just keep buying it. It remains a bestseller for Amazon. It's a phenomenon. It sells more copies each year than the year before. Howard Zinn was a historian. He taught at Spelman College and at Boston University. But he was a rock star historian. He was beloved by, rock stars. Bruce Springsteen was his friend. Pearl Jam devoted a song to him. Jane Fonda mourned his death and wrote a tribute to him. And so he achieved the kind of reputation that so many academics and historians wish they'd achieved, at least to reach that many people. Howard Zinn rode to fame and fortune on the untold story of Christopher Columbus, a shocking tale of severed hands, raped women, and gentle enslaved people who worked to death to shake the white Europeans' lust for gold. Today, that story is anything but untold. Zinn's narrative about the genocidal discoverer of America has captured our education system and popular culture. Zinn is the inspiration behind the current campaign to abolish Columbus Day and replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day. High school teachers cite his book in making the case for renaming to their local communities. The Zinn Education Project is a nonprofit started by one of his students. They have a campaign for the classroom called Abolish Columbus Day. They send out free teacher kits to teachers of third graders who have them write letters to local officials to abolish Columbus. And what they learn about Columbus is based on Zinn. According to Professor James Green, who noted in 2003 that nearly every college textbook published during the last 2 decades now begins, as Zinn did, with the European destruction of the Indians. Zinn was quite proud of that accomplishment. He lived to see the day when, on the 500th anniversary of Columbus's first landing in the New World, Americans were bitterly divided over whether Columbus Day should be a day of celebration or mourning, of pride or shame. That was, as he wrote in his autobiography, one of his greatest accomplishments. The identity of this country, even before the founding, is identified with Columbus. So during the War for Independence, America distanced herself from Britannia by calling herself Columbia. Columbus's discovery was celebrated in 1792. King's College became Columbia University. The new capital was the District of Columbia. Washington Irving, in 1828, the famous writer, wrote the best-selling multi-volume history of Christopher Columbus and of the discovery The 400th anniversary, 1892, there were parades, civic gatherings, speeches, church services, and a proclamation by President Benjamin Harrison. And he said, observe Columbus Day. He called him the pioneer of progress and enlightenment. The quoted passage from Columbus's log continues with Columbus's description of the Arawaks. He describes them as well-built and handsomely featured. Having never seen iron, they accidentally cut themselves on the European swords when they touched them. The passage ends with Columbus's famous, now infamous words. They have no iron. Their spears are made out of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. And this was a passage that was read during an episode of The Sopranos, where the teenage son, AJ, is doing his homework in the morning and his father gets upset and he says, and AJ says, well, my teacher told me this is true. And this guy named Howard Zinn said it was true. There are ellipses in this passage, those 3 or 4 dots that everyone learns about in English class. You put those in when you're quoting and you don't have room for the entire quote, but it's not supposed to change the meaning, right? And so, of course, I'm writing this and I say the ellipses in this passage are Zinn's, not mine. And as we shall see, those omissions are essential to Zinn's dishonest retelling of the Columbus story. By leaving crucial words out of the quotation, Zinn makes Columbus say something very different from what he actually said. Zinn began and finished a people's history of the United States in less than a year after he returned from a 4-month professorship in Paris in 1978. This fact, quote, surprises people and sometimes makes them think I obviously did it in a hurry and didn't spend much time on it, he explained. But he claimed I'd been accumulating the notes and material, the data for 20 years as a result of teaching and writing about history. Once he sat down at his typewriter, he claims it came very fast. But there is no evidence that Zinn ever actually made extensive notes in preparation for writing a people's history. On the contrary, there is telling proof that he did no such thing. It's unlikely that he even read as much of Columbus's journals or the works of Las Casas, the great eyewitness, as he claimed. The truth, Zinn based his famous opening pages on a controversial book written for high school students. And while Koning's work was treated dismissively, Zinn's transcriptions of Koning's material to his own book are taken as groundbreaking historical revelations. And that's a unique aspect of his book. And it's been noted by others. People believe it, especially the young and the naive. It's like, this has to be true. And he's very good with words. I have to give that to him. And few know that they are little more than transcriptions. Zinn perpetuates Koning's smears and Koning's telling, and in Zinn's, Columbus set out to enslave a uniformly gentle people for the sole purpose of enriching himself with gold. In fact, that is far from the truth. As you probably know, European efforts to find a sea route to Asia had been going on for hundreds of years. But Zinn's most crucial omissions are in the passage from Columbus's log that he quotes in the very first paragraph. There he uses ellipses to cover up the fact that he has left out enough of Columbus's words to deceive his readers about what the discoverer of America actually meant. The omission, right before they would make fine servants, which AJ reads, right, is particularly dishonest. And again, that passage is, they have no iron, their spears are made out of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all, make them do whatever we want. Here's the nub of what Zinn left out. This is what he wrote. I saw some who bore marks of wounds on their bodies, and I made signs to them to ask how this came about. and they indicated to me that people came from other islands which are near and wished to capture them, and they defended themselves. And I believed and still believe that they come here from the mainland to take them for slaves. So there is a hostile tribe, and they've got scars from their battles. There's a tribe called the Caribs that are trying to capture them. So the natives are not all uniformly gentle people, as Zinn pretends. He said that actually when what Columbus was referring to when he said they would make fine servants was what the Caribs, the hostile tribe, was thinking of. But Zinn makes it appear that that's what Columbus is thinking with those ellipses. And what I point out is that those ellipses between the two phrases, they would make fine servants, the ellipses, and then with 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Those ellipses indicate 2 days worth of passages. Pages, okay? Fail, 0 for this paper. But people believe it. People like AJ, a teenager in school, they believe it. This is the truth. Zinn's selective quotations are designed to give the impression that Columbus had no concern for the Indians' spiritual or physical well-being, that the explorer was motivated only by a frenzy for money that drove him to enslave the natives for profit when he wasn't hunting them down with dogs because they couldn't supply him with large quantities of gold from supposed mines, whose very existence was part fiction created by Columbus himself. But literally, the explorer's first concern, the hope that he expressed in the initial comment about the natives, was for the Indians' freedom and their eternal salvation. And this is a quote from him: "I want the natives to develop a friendly attitude toward us because I know that they are a people who can be made free and converted to our holy faith more by love than by force." That's from the 2 pages of excised material. Zinn just entirely omits the passage in which Columbus expresses his respect and concern for the Indians. Students will not learn from Howard Zinn about how Columbus tried to protect the Taínos from the Caribs, or that he did not own any slaves personally, or that when the Caribs were enslaved, now these were a hostile tribe, they were said to be cannibals. It was a common practice at the time for prisoners of war that they were enslaved as prisoners of war. That was actually seen as an improvement, because before then, prisoners of war were just killed. So, but that was a new convention in warfare, and it was seen as morally advanced, and he wanted to give them a chance to convert. Columbus never did any of those things Zinn said he did. He gave instructions to his men to treat them with kindness and fairness. He brought back 6 after the first of his 4 trips. He had them baptized and adopted one as his godson. His intent was to save their souls and make them free by conversion to the faith. On the second voyage, with 17 ships, they discovered Guadalupe and the Caribs who lived there. The Caribs were the enslavers. The Caribs persecuted the Taínos, raping the women, castrating the boys, and cannibalizing the men. Columbus rescued as many of the Taínos as he could and brought them to their home. Why would he lie? Well, we have to know who Howard Zinn is, and I think a lot of you already know who he was. Zinn grew up in the 1930s in Brooklyn. His parents never achieved the American dream as they thought. They were Russian Jewish immigrants. Zinn was very bitter because he had to work with his father as a caddy and a caterer. Hey, as immigrants, I'm an immigrant. I know, you take any job you can get. So he was lured in by the communists as a teenager in the 1930s. And he went to this, what he called a peaceful protest in front of Times Square. And they were just peaceful, but the policemen started knocking them on their heads with the batons. And he woke up, he came to in a doorway, and he thought to himself, and this is what he writes in his autobiography, which is taught to school children, those young communists on the block were right. The state and its police were on the side of the rich and powerful. From that day, he was a believer in Marxism. This book basically follows Friedrich Engels' 1847 speech called The Discovery of America, which claimed that Columbus's discovery led to the struggle of propertyless against the property owners. Engels charged that Columbus began the path of destruction in this Garden of Eden that was occupied by gentle native people who never committed any crimes, no violence, no war. It was perfectly peaceful, and then it was ruined by that greedy capitalist, Columbus. That is the standard Communist Party line. It was repeated by Communist Party Chairman William Z. Foster in his 1951 book called Outline Political History of the Americas. Howard Zinn, while he was still a graduate student, was teaching Marxism at the Communist Party headquarters in Brooklyn, New York. And Howard Zinn was a member of the Communist Party from about 1948 to 1953. His FBI files say that. I rely on the authority of Ron Radish, a historian who also was briefly a member of the party. He compared Zinn's file, 500 pages, to his own. He said he was a communist. And like many communists of the 1950s, he obeyed party orders to drop official membership and go into the institutions. And he was very successful at that. Zinn knew how to turn it in, use lingo like the establishment with a capital E, the system with a capital S in his book. So he twisted it around. And so what we basically have is communist propaganda. And it makes what was said about Columbus and what Columbus said himself to be the opposite. And Zinn did this with other issues about the Vietnam War, about the Civil War, about slavery, and he does this throughout. He makes this appeal, and it's his style, his propagandistic style is very sophisticated. He was able to capture the confidence of people, especially young people. And so, great historians like Gordon Wood, Bernard Bailyn, who was Gordon Wood's mentor, these giants of history are trashed by Zinn by his claims that they uphold imperialism and murder and so forth. And he knocks them down. But and then the other thing he does is he asks these questions, a series of questions. And so the reader who, doesn't look at this and say, what are you doing here? Someone who's young says, wow, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of that. And then he emotionally engages. He uses emotional appeals. And the other thing is that readers read this and they feel like they don't need to read any other book, because he says, I'm giving you the whole story. What other people are telling you, the patriotic story, the good story, is wrong. I've uncovered this. We know he hasn't uncovered this. I mean, this goes back to the 19th century. And the reason to attack Columbus is, the reason why our great heroes are being attacked, like in the summer of 2020. I mean, these standards that are placed on people of the past, they have to be saints. No one is a saint, right? But the reason you attack Columbus is you attack the very legitimacy of this country. Zinn comes out and says, this country is not real. I forget the word that he uses. He says it's illegitimate. We have no reason to be here. It's a pretense. I think he uses that word. And so where do you start to get to that place? You start with the person who discovered America. So the whole program right from the beginning is he claims is based on murder, exploitation, enslavement. So the whole, we need to start over. And that's his objective. Because as he goes through page by page, the reader will say, wow, this didn't work. The Constitution is corrupt. Oh, the Equal Voting Rights Act won't have any impact. Oh, women's suffrage, they're still slaves. He compares women to slaves. This is really insulting. None of this is just because we still have an unequal distribution of property, of wealth. And the founders were hypocrites. And so you have to start with Columbus. But I'll just end with this. Zinn also, yes, did quote Bartolome de las Casas. But as you can imagine, that was twisted around, and it's in my book. But there's one passage that he did not quote, and I point out in my book. This is what Las Casas said about Columbus. Now, this was the crusading priest who had this conversion experience. He was originally a plantation owner, had slaves, and he was influenced by a sermon and said, we should not enslave the natives. For a while, he thought that Africans could be enslaved, but even, towards the end of his life, he's changed his mind on that. But what he wrote was intended to be inspirational to end slavery. And he exaggerated the abuses, but he wanted to end slavery. He thought it was evil. But he was not talking about Columbus. He was talking about the men who came after him, quite frankly, because he came mostly after Columbus died. So this is what he writes about Columbus. Many is the time I have wished that God would again inspire me, and that I had Cicero's gift of eloquence to extol the indescribable service to God and to the whole world, which Christopher Columbus rendered at the cost of such pain and dangers, such skill and expertise, when he so courageously discovered the New World. And I think that's what students need to learn.